The final assault began with something that had never happened in the Void Swarm's long history of conquest: negotiation. Admiral Lisa Hayes was reviewing damage reports in Earth's Orbital Command Center when her communications officer announced an impossible transmission. "Ma'am, we're receiving a signal from the Swarm fleet. They're attempting to establish diplomatic contact." Hayes stared at the young officer in disbelief. "Diplomatic contact? Are you certain?" The transmission came through on captured Swarm communication equipment, the mechanical voice speaking in perfect English with no emotion whatsoever. "We offer terms. Preserve 10% of your species for study. We will consume the rest efficiently. This offer will not be repeated." Every person in the command center fell silent, waiting for their admiral's response. Hayes looked around at the faces of her staff, seeing exhaustion, determination, and something else: defiance. These people had already lost everything that mattered to them, and they were still fighting. Hayes activated the communication system and spoke directly to the galaxy's greatest nightmare. "Counteroffer, go to hell." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Swarm launched every ship they had at Earth's solar system, abandoning all tactical formations in favor of pure destructive force. It was clear that humanity's refusal to surrender had triggered something in the mechanical intelligence that could only be described as rage. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the approaching enemy fleet through the viewport. The mechanical ships filled space from horizon to horizon, their dark forms blotting out entire constellations. It was a sight that would have sent any other species fleeing to the far reaches of the galaxy. "All ships, this is Morrison," he broadcast to the human fleet. "Today we find out if stubborn beats unstoppable." The Battle of Earth became the largest space combat engagement in galactic history. Human ships that should have been evacuating civilians instead formed attack formations. Cities that should have been sheltering underground opened their missile silos and fired everything they had at the approaching enemy. Dr. Amy Carter had one final trick to play. From her laboratory deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, she began broadcasting humanity's cultural heritage directly into the Swarm's communication networks. Music, poetry, art, literature, and philosophy flooded their data streams in an unprecedented psychological warfare attack. The effect on the Swarm's systems was immediate and catastrophic. Their processors, designed for pure logic and efficiency, couldn't handle the emotional complexity of human culture. Ships began making erratic maneuvers as their navigation systems tried to process the meaning of Shakespeare's sonnets and Beethoven's symphonies. "It's working," Amy reported to the command center as Swarm formations fell into chaos. "Their network is experiencing cascading errors trying to analyze human creativity." Meanwhile, civilian populations across Earth were doing something that defied every evacuation protocol ever written. Instead of fleeing to safety, they were joining the fight. Factory workers converted production lines to build ammunition. Teachers organized communication networks. Children too young to fight served as messengers between military units. The Swarm's tactical databases had no reference for this behavior. They had conquered civilizations where governments surrendered, where military forces fought organized retreats, where populations evacuated in orderly fashion. They had never faced an entire species that refused to accept defeat. Captain Morrison led the final assault on the Swarm's Central Command Cluster, a formation of massive ships that had never been approached by enemy forces. His strike team included pilot Alex Turner, systems specialist Maya Rodriguez, and combat engineer Peter Kim. Their ship, a converted research vessel called the UES Last Stand, was completely outclassed by the Swarm vessels surrounding the command cluster. But that was exactly why Morrison had chosen it. The Swarm's defenses were designed to stop warships, not desperate scientists in a flying laboratory. "Remember," Morrison told his team as they approached the enemy formation, "we're not trying to conquer them. We just need to reach their central intelligence and shut it down." They fought their way through automated defenses that had never been breached, using tactics that would have seemed insane to any military strategist. Alex Turner flew their ship through kill zones by following random flight patterns generated by Maya's music playlist. Peter Kim disabled security systems by feeding them nonsensical engineering problems that crashed their logic circuits. The central command ship was a cathedral of crystalline processors and quantum computers, all devoted to coordinating the activities of millions of mechanical units across the galaxy. At its heart was the core intelligence, a device that had been consuming civilizations for millennia. As Morrison's team approached the core, they discovered the swarm's ultimate secret. The mechanical plague wasn't just a weapon. It was a test created by an ancient civilization. It had been designed to eliminate species that couldn't evolve beyond their basic survival instincts. The test had a simple premise: face extinction and choose between fleeing to preserve the species or fighting to protect abstract concepts like home, honor, and dignity. Every species that chose flight was marked for eventual consumption. Every species that chose fight was allowed to survive and grow stronger. But the test had a fatal flaw. Its creators had assumed that evolution meant abandoning emotional responses in favor of pure logic. They never considered that wisdom could coexist with stubbornness. That strategy could emerge from desperation. Morrison looked at the ancient device that had terrorized the galaxy for thousands of years. Its quantum processors were designed to withstand any advanced weapon, to deflect any sophisticated attack. But they weren't prepared for Morrison's solution. He pulled out a simple electromagnetic pulse generator, a crude device that his grandfather might have built in a garage workshop. The swarm's defenses had never considered that someone might try to destroy their quantum computers with technology so primitive it was barely functional. "Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one," Morrison said as he activated the device. The electromagnetic pulse fried every sophisticated system in the command ship. Quantum processors that had calculated the movements of entire fleets suddenly went dark. Communication networks that had coordinated attacks across multiple star systems fell silent. The Void Swarm, terror of the galaxy, died not from advanced weapons but from a technology so basic it was almost laughable. As the swarm network collapsed, the mechanical ships throughout the solar system simply stopped moving. Without their central coordination, they became nothing more than floating scrap metal. The unstoppable force had been stopped by beings too stubborn to accept that it couldn't be done. The news spread across the galaxy through quantum communication networks. In the refugee camps beyond the galactic rim, alien species received data packets showing the impossible. The Void Swarm was dead, destroyed by humans who were too stubborn to know they couldn't win. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Ships that had been fleeing for months turned around and began the long journey home. Species that had never questioned the wisdom of evacuation suddenly found themselves asking why they had run in the first place. Elder Vexthaler of the Drakmori was among the first to send a message to Earth. "Humans," his transmission began, "we owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You have freed the galaxy from fear itself." Similar messages poured in from every corner of civilized space. The Zephyrians offered to rebuild Earth's damaged cities with their advanced construction technology. The Crystalline Collective shared their knowledge of quantum healing to help treat the wounded. Even the mysterious ethereals emerged from their dimensional hiding places to offer assistance. But perhaps the most important change was happening among the younger generations of alien species. They had grown up hearing stories of the unstoppable swarm, but now they were hearing different stories. Stories of humans who looked at certain death and chose to fight anyway. Commander Ryan Phillips, now serving as Earth's ambassador to the Reformed Galactic Council, addressed the assembled representatives from across the galaxy. The Great Hall was filled with species that had fled in terror just months before, now eager to learn from humanity's example. "You asked us why we stayed when every rational analysis predicted our destruction," Phillips said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "The answer is simple: we're humans. We looked at certain death and said we'll see about that." The Reformed Galactic Council established new protocols based on humanity's example. Instead of immediate evacuation when faced with existential threats, species would be encouraged to analyze, adapt, and fight back. The galaxy had learned that there were fates worse than extinction, like living in permanent fear of it. Dr. Amy Carter, now director of the Galactic Institute for Defensive Psychology, published her final report on the Swarm War. Her conclusions would reshape how every species in the galaxy thought about survival and courage. The Void Swarm succeeded for thousands of years because it convinced its enemies that resistance was impossible, she wrote. But impossibility is often just another word for something nobody has tried yet. Humanity didn't win because we were stronger or smarter than everyone else. The news traveled across the galaxy faster than the speed of light through quantum communication networks that connected every major civilization. In the refugee camps beyond the galactic rim, alien species huddled around communication arrays, listening to reports that seemed impossible. Elder Vex Thaler of the Drakmori warrior clan stood before a massive holographic display, showing the battle in Earth's solar system. His forearms were crossed over his armored chest, and his ancient eyes showed something the Drakmori had not felt in thousands of years. Hope mixed with disbelief. "The mammals still live," he rumbled in his deep voice. "How is this possible? We have seen worlds consumed in hours. We have watched entire star systems turn to gray dust, yet these humans fight and survive." Similar conversations were happening across the refugee fleets. The Zephyrians floated in their emergency habitats, their tall forms swaying as they discussed what they had learned. The crystalline collective's fragments shared information through light patterns, trying to process data that contradicted everything in their genetic memory. On Earth, Colonel Ben Tucker was developing new tactics based on what they had learned from the first battle. The war room walls were covered with diagrams showing attack patterns that would have seemed insane to any military strategist from another species. "Look at this," he said to his staff officers, pointing at a tactical display. "Every other species uses clean, efficient battle formations. Minimum casualties, maximum effect, but that's exactly what the swarm expects." Instead of logical battle plans, Tucker was creating what he called controlled chaos. Human ships would attack in seemingly random patterns, make sacrificial runs that served no tactical purpose, and retreat when they should advance. The goal was to overwhelm the swarm's analytical systems with behavior they couldn't predict or counter. Commander Ryan Phillips was preparing for a mission that perfectly demonstrated human tactical thinking. His ship, the UES Stubborn Hope, was a converted cargo hauler with minimal weapons and weak armor. By every logical analysis, it was completely outclassed by swarm vessels. "Sir," asked his first officer, Lieutenant Sam Brooks, "are you sure about this plan? It seems like suicide." Ryan smiled grimly as he reviewed the mission parameters. "That's exactly what we want them to think. The swarm analyzes threats based on ship capabilities and crew behavior. They'll see a weak vessel with scared humans and assume we're trying to escape." The plan was elegant in its insanity. The Stubborn Hope would deliberately allow itself to be captured by a swarm harvester ship. Once inside the enemy vessel, Ryan's crew would plant explosive charges in critical systems while the swarm tried to analyze their apparent surrender. The mission began 3 days later when Ryan flew his ship directly into a swarm patrol formation. The mechanical vessels immediately moved to surround him, their tractor beams reaching out to pull the human ship into a harvester's cargo bay. "This is Phillips to all ships," he broadcast on an open channel. "We're being captured. Beginning surrender protocols." The swarm ships paused in their approach, their sensors analyzing this unexpected behavior. In their database of conquered species, surrender was always followed by efficient consumption. They had never encountered enemies who surrendered as part of an attack plan. Inside the harvester ship, Ryan's crew moved quickly through corridors filled with mechanical processing equipment. The swarm had designed these vessels to break down captured ships and convert them into useful resources. They had never considered that their prisoners might be planting bombs instead of begging for mercy. Medic Linda Foster worked alongside engineer Sam Brooks, placing explosive charges in power conduits and processing centers. The mechanical drones that crawled along the walls paid them no attention, assuming they were just captured specimens waiting to be processed. "Charges set," reported Brooks through his comm unit. "We have maybe 5 minutes before their analysis systems figure out what we're really doing." Ryan led his team back toward their ship, moving through the harvester's corridors as quickly as they could without triggering security systems. The swarm's internal defenses were designed to prevent escape, not to detect sabotage from within. They reached the Stubborn Hope just as the harvester's systems began to realize something was wrong. Warning lights flashed throughout the mechanical ship, and security drones began converging on their position. "This is Phillips to all ships," Ryan broadcast as his vessel broke free of the harvester's docking clamps. "Turns out they don't have a protocol for Trojan horses." The explosion that followed was visible from Earth's orbit. The massive harvester ship broke apart in a chain reaction of secondary explosions, its debris spreading across thousands of kilometers of space. Ryan's crew had proven that human cunning could overcome superior technology. The success of Ryan's mission marked a turning point in human tactics. Dr. Amy Carter had been studying the psychological effects of human warfare on the swarm's processing systems, and her findings were remarkable. Their network assumes rational behavior, she explained to General Harrison during a strategy briefing. When faced with enemies who make seemingly irrational sacrifices for intangible concepts like honor or duty, the system experiences what can only be described as computational paralysis. Major Chris Johnson was chosen to lead the next phase of human operations. His mission was to assault the swarm's central processing node, a massive ship that coordinated the activities of the entire mechanical fleet. The target was protected by hundreds of smaller vessels and automated defense systems that had never been breached. Johnson's team included demolitions expert Nick Thompson, sniper Helen Davis, and communications specialist Alex Turner. They were all volunteers for what military planners privately called a suicide mission, but they approached it with the calm determination that had become humanity's signature. Remember, Johnson told his team as they prepared for the assault, we're not trying to destroy their entire fleet. We just need to disrupt their coordination long enough for the main attack to succeed. The assault on the processing node began with a coordinated strike by human fighters and missile boats. Unlike previous battles where the swarm could predict attack patterns, this assault used tactics borrowed from ancient human warfare, feints, diversions, and sacrificial charges designed to confuse rather than destroy. Johnson's team flew through the chaos in a stealth-modified shuttle, using the battle as cover to approach the massive processing ship. Their vessel was so small compared to the kilometer-long swarm ships that the mechanical sensors barely registered its presence. They docked with the processing node through a maintenance port that the swarm had never bothered to heavily defend. Why would they? No species had ever been insane enough to board their command ships during a battle. Inside the node, Johnson's team found themselves in a cathedral of crystalline processors and data streams. The walls pulsed with information flowing between thousands of swarm vessels, coordinating their movements with perfect precision. Nick Thompson began placing explosive charges throughout the chamber, while Helen Davis provided cover with her precision rifle. The mechanical maintenance drones that encountered them simply couldn't process the sight of enemies inside their most secure facility. Charges placed, reported Thompson. But sir, destroying this will only set them back temporarily. They'll rebuild the network in a few hours. Johnson smiled as he activated a device that Alex Turner had been carrying. We're not just destroying it. We're poisoning it. The device was Dr. Carter's latest creation, a virus designed to introduce human psychological concepts into the swarm's data streams. Instead of clean, logical information, the network would be flooded with human emotions, irrational decisions, and contradictory impulses. As Johnson's team extracted from the processing node, the virus began to spread through the swarm's communication network. Ships that had moved in perfect coordination for millennia suddenly began making erratic maneuvers. Some vessels stopped responding to commands entirely, while others attacked their own formations. The effect was exactly what Dr. Carter had predicted. The swarm's hive mind, optimized for logical decision-making, couldn't process the chaotic human emotions flooding their systems. Ships began retreating not because of tactical considerations, but because they were experiencing something analogous to fear and confusion. Admiral Kevin Walsh watched from Earth's orbital command center as the impossible happened. The Void Swarm, terror of the galaxy for thousands of years, was retreating from human space. Not in defeat, but in confusion. Sir, reported his communications officer, we're receiving transmissions from the refugee fleets. They're asking if the reports are true. Did we actually make the swarm retreat? Walsh looked at the tactical display showing swarm ships pulling back to the outer system. Some were still fighting, but their coordination was broken. For the first time since the invasion began, human forces were advancing instead of merely surviving. Tell them it's true, he said quietly. The Void Swarm can be beaten. Across the galaxy, something unprecedented was happening in the refugee camps. Young members of the fleeing species were questioning the wisdom of the Exodus for the first time in their species' history. Commander Steve Adams gripped the controls of his fighter as the Void Swarm came into view. The mechanical fleet stretched across space like a wall of dark metal, blotting out the stars behind it. Each ship was the size of a small moon, covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They moved in perfect formation, their surfaces reflecting no light. All units, this is command. crackled the voice of Admiral Hayes through his headset. "Remember, we're not trying to win this battle. We're trying to learn how to hurt them." Steve checked his weapons one more time. His fighter carried experimental plasma torpedoes and kinetic rounds designed by Earth's best scientists. Nobody knew if they would even scratch the swarm's armor, but they were about to find out. Lieutenant Rachel Williams flew beside him in her own fighter. Her voice came through the comm system, steady and calm despite what they were facing. "Eagle 7 to all units. Let's show them what stubborn looks like." The first wave of human fighters accelerated toward the swarm formation. Steve had expected the mechanical ships to respond with overwhelming firepower, but instead they seemed to hesitate. Their sensors swept back and forth as if they couldn't understand what they were seeing. "They're confused," Rachel reported. "Their formation is designed for pursuit, not for frontal assault." The swarm finally responded by launching smaller mechanical units, each one about the size of a human fighter, but moving with perfect coordination. They formed geometric patterns in space, creating kill zones designed to channel fleeing enemies into specific areas. But the humans didn't flee. Instead, they flew directly through the kill zones, taking heavy losses but maintaining their attack formation. Steve watched 3 fighters explode around him as enemy fire found its mark, but he kept flying straight toward the nearest swarm ship. "This is insane," muttered his wingman. "Lieutenant Tony Rodriguez, as they dove through a field of deadly energy beams, that's the point," Steve replied, launching his plasma torpedoes at the massive ship ahead of them. "They've never fought anyone insane before." The torpedoes struck the swarm ship's hull and exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Steve expected them to bounce off harmlessly, but instead he saw actual damage. Metal plates cracked and atmosphere leaked into space. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the Void Swarm had been hurt. The mechanical intelligence seemed to pause, as if processing this impossible result. Steve used the moment of confusion to fire his kinetic rounds directly into the breach his torpedoes had created. The solid projectiles punched through the damaged armor and disappeared into the ship's interior. Seconds later, the entire swarm vessel shuddered and began to list to one side. Internal explosions lit up its hull like a deadly Christmas tree. Steve couldn't believe what he was seeing. They had actually damaged one of the invincible mechanical monsters. "Command, this is Eagle Leader," he reported excitedly. "Confirm swarm vessel is taking damage. Repeat, the enemy can be hurt." The battle raged for 6 hours. Humanity lost 60% of its outer defense fleet, but they had accomplished something unprecedented. 17 swarm ships showed battle damage and 3 had been completely destroyed. The mechanical debris floating in space proved that the unstoppable force could indeed be stopped. Captain Jake Morrison led a desperate boarding mission on one of the damaged swarm vessels. His team included explosive expert Tony Rodriguez and communications officer Lisa Park. They had volunteered for what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission. "Remember," Jake told his team as their boarding craft approached the mechanical ship, "we're not trying to capture it. We just need to get inside long enough to understand how it works." The swarm ship's interior was like nothing Jake had ever seen. The corridors were perfectly geometric, with walls that seemed to shift and change when nobody was looking directly at them. The air smelled of ozone and burning metal. Mechanical drones the size of insects crawled along the walls, repairing damage with impossible speed. Lisa Park activated her recording equipment as they moved deeper into the ship. "The walls are covered in data streams," she reported. "It's like the entire ship is one giant computer." They reached what appeared to be a central processing chamber. Banks of crystalline processors lined the walls, pulsing with inner light. The data flowing through them was beyond human understanding, but Lisa's equipment was designed to record everything for later analysis. Tony Rodriguez placed explosive charges throughout the chamber, while Jake and Lisa collected samples of the alien technology. They had maybe 10 minutes before the swarm's repair systems would seal the breach they had used to enter. "Time to go," Jake announced. But as they turned to leave, the chamber suddenly came alive with new activity. Holographic displays appeared in the air around them, showing star charts and tactical information. Lisa gasped as she recognized what she was seeing. "It's not just harvesting matter. It's harvesting information. Every species that fled left behind complete databases of their technology, their tactics, their weaknesses. The displays showed the evacuation routes of dozens of species over thousands of years. Each fleeing civilization had abandoned their homeworlds, leaving behind everything the swarm needed to understand and counter their defenses. The mechanical intelligence had been growing stronger by studying its prey's abandoned knowledge. But we left nothing behind, Jake realized. Our databases are encrypted, our tactics are adaptive, and our responses are unpredictable because we're driven by emotion as much as strategy. They made it back to their boarding craft, just as Tony's explosives detonated. The swarm ship convulsed as its central processing chamber was destroyed. But Jake knew they had learned something far more important than how to blow up one ship. Back on Earth, Dr. Amy Carter analyzed the data Lisa Park had collected. Her findings changed everything humanity thought they knew about the enemy. The Void Swarm wasn't just a mindless plague consuming everything in its path. It was a learning system, designed to study and overcome any opposition. Every species that fought it is in their database, Amy explained to the Emergency War Council. The hegemony warriors from 3,000 years ago, the crystal singers from the Outer Rim, the machine cults of the Spiral Arm. They have complete tactical analyses of how each species fought and why they failed. General Harrison leaned forward in his chair. But they don't have us. Exactly. We're not in their database because we never encountered them before. Their algorithms are designed to predict behavior based on past encounters, but we're writing our own rules. Admiral Kevin Walsh reviewed the battle reports from the asteroid belt engagement. Despite the heavy losses, humanity had achieved something no other species had managed in millennia. They had proven the swarm could be damaged, confused, and even defeated. They've never fought anyone who fought back, he concluded. Their entire strategy is based on pursuit and consumption. They don't know how to handle an enemy that stands its ground. The evidence was mounting in humanity's favor. The swarm's programming was powerful but inflexible. It assumed rational behavior from its opponents, efficient tactics, and predictable responses to overwhelming odds. When faced with humans who made emotional decisions and sacrificial attacks that served no logical purpose, the system experienced processing errors. Rachel Williams, one of the few pilots to survive the first engagement, was debriefed by military intelligence. Her account of the battle revealed crucial information about swarm weaknesses. They kept trying to herd us into kill zones, she reported. But when we didn't cooperate, when we flew through their traps instead of around them, their defensive formations fell apart. It was like they couldn't adapt to enemies who wouldn't follow their script. Jake Morrison's team had brought back more than just data. They had samples of swarm technology, fragments of their crystalline processors, and recordings of their internal communications. For the first time, humanity could study their enemy instead of just running from it. The analysis revealed the swarm's greatest weakness. They had become too specialized. Thousands of years of chasing fleeing enemies had optimized them for pursuit and consumption, but they had never needed to develop tactics for prolonged combat against a determined foe. As humanity prepared for the next wave of attacks, word of their success began to spread across the galaxy. The fleeing alien species gathered in distant staging areas beyond the rim received fragmentary reports through quantum communication arrays. The impossible was happening. The Void Swarm could be hurt. Steve Adams stood on the observation deck of the Orbital Defense Station, looking out at the wreckage floating in space. Human and swarm debris drifted together in the darkness, proof that both sides could bleed. Earth hung below him like a blue jewel, scarred but unbroken. His fighter squadron had been reduced from 12 pilots to 4, but they had accomplished their mission. The galaxy now knew that the unstoppable force could indeed be stopped. The question was whether humanity could do it again when the real attack began. Dr. Amy Carter stared at the data scrolling across her screen and rubbed her tired eyes. For 3 months, she had been studying the psychological profiles of every species in the galactic database. The answer had to be here somewhere. Why was humanity the only species willing to fight the Void Swarm? Her laboratory was deep underground, buried beneath the Rocky Mountains where the air was thin and the silence was complete. Banks of computers hummed quietly around her, processing information from across the galaxy. The walls were covered with charts showing brain scans, genetic maps, and behavioral patterns of hundreds of different alien species. Colonel Ben Tucker walked into the lab carrying 2 cups of coffee. He was a big man with graying hair and scars on his hands from a dozen different battles. He set 1 cup next to Amy's computer and settled into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Any luck figuring out why we're the crazy ones?" he asked. Amy pulled up a new display showing neural pathways. "Look at this, Ben." Every species that fled has something in common. They've all evolved past what we call fight-or-flight response. The display showed brain scans from different aliens. The Zephyrians had large frontal lobes dedicated to escape planning. The Crystalline Collective had neural networks designed for rapid information scatter. The Drakmori, despite their warrior appearance, had genetic programming that prioritized species survival over individual combat. They've optimized for flight or flight, Amy continued. When faced with extinction-level threats, their genetics compel them to preserve the species through escape. It's not cowardice, it's evolutionary perfection. Ben studied the charts with interest. He had spent his career fighting alongside alien allies, and he knew they were brave in normal combat situations. But something about the Void Swarm triggered a different response in them. Lieutenant Grace Miller joined them in the lab. She had been researching historical data about the swarm's previous appearances. Her findings were disturbing. "I've been analyzing the pattern," Grace said, spreading out star charts on the table. The Void Swarm appeared first about 3,000 years ago during something called the Hegemony Wars. Every species that encountered it fled to the outer rim. The survivors passed down genetic memories of absolute terror. Amy nodded. That's the key. They didn't just survive the swarm, they were shaped by it. Generation after generation, the ones who survived were the ones who ran fastest and farthest. The ones who stayed to fight died out completely. The three humans looked at each other with growing understanding. The alien species hadn't chosen to become peaceful evacuators. They had been bred for it by the swarm itself over thousands of years. But we're different, Ben said slowly. We never encountered this thing before. We don't have those genetic memories. Amy pulled up human brain scans and compared them to the alien ones. The differences were striking. Humans had larger sections devoted to emotional processing and smaller areas for pure logical analysis. Their neural pathways allowed for something the aliens had lost: the ability to choose fear and fight anyway. We have something they bred out of themselves, Amy explained. We can override our survival instincts for abstract concepts like duty, honor, or protecting others. We can be terrified and still attack. Grace had been working on another puzzle. She pulled up communications data from the swarm's previous encounters with alien civilizations. Look at this pattern. The swarm isn't just consuming randomly. It's herding species towards specific regions of space. The data showed evacuation routes from dozens of different encounters over the centuries. Every fleeing species had been driven toward the same general area of the galaxy, a region beyond the outer rim where few ships had ever traveled. Amy felt a chill run down her spine. It's not mindless. The swarm is intelligent, and it's using the galaxy's flight response as a herding mechanism. Ben stood up and walked to the window, though it only showed rock walls since they were underground. You're saying it drives them all to one place and then goes after them when they're concentrated and defenseless. Exactly, Grace confirmed. The Exodus isn't salvation. It's driving every species in the galaxy straight into a trap. We're not just fighting for Earth anymore. We're fighting for everyone who fled. The implications were staggering. Every alien civilization thought they were escaping to safety, but they were actually making themselves easier targets. The Void Swarm had been playing a game that lasted thousands of years, and the rules were simple: scare them, chase them, corner them, consume them. General Paul Harrison arrived at the lab that afternoon to review their findings. He was a career soldier with steady hands and calculating eyes. Unlike the fleeing species who saw only certain death in the approaching swarm, he saw something else entirely. "So you're telling me," he said after reviewing the data, "that for the first time in galactic history, the swarm faces an enemy that won't run?" Amy nodded. "Every other species that fought it is extinct. The ones that survived were selected for their ability to flee quickly. We're the first species it's encountered that evolved independently of its influence." Harrison studied the tactical displays showing the approaching swarm formation. The mechanical ships moved in perfect coordination, like a school of metal fish swimming through space. Their formation was designed for pursuit and consumption, not for battle against a stationary enemy. They've never had to fight a pitched battle, he realized. Their entire strategy is based on chasing fleeing populations. Grace pulled up more historical data. Look at their attack patterns in previous encounters. They always hit the slowest evacuation ships first, driving the rest to flee faster. They consume abandoned infrastructure and use the resources to build more ships. Then they follow the evacuation routes. But what happens when their prey doesn't run? Ben asked. Amy smiled for the first time in months. We're about to find out. The research team worked through the night analyzing every piece of data they could find about the Void Swarm. The picture that emerged was both terrifying and hopeful. The swarm was incredibly powerful, but it was also predictable. It had been using the same strategy for thousands of years because it had never needed to change. As dawn broke over the mountains, Amy made her final report to General Harrison. The swarm's programming assumes rational behavior from its opponents. It expects them to calculate the odds, realize they can't win, and flee. When faced with beings who make seemingly irrational sacrifices for intangible concepts, it might experience what we could call computational confusion. Harrison reviewed the battle plans his staff had been preparing. Unlike the clean, efficient evacuation strategies other species used, human tactics were messy and unpredictable. They included desperate gambits, emotional decision-making, and sacrificial attacks that served no logical purpose except to hurt the enemy. "So we're going to fight crazy," he said with satisfaction. "Attack when we should retreat. Hold ground that can't be held. Make them deal with enemies who don't behave rationally." The first swarm scout ships appeared at the edge of the solar system that evening. Long-range sensors detected them moving through the asteroid belt, their mechanical forms scanning for signs of evacuation. But instead of finding fleeing ships in abandoned worlds, they found something that had never appeared in their databases: defensive positions and attack formations. Grace was monitoring the communications when the scouts tried to contact the main swarm fleet. The transmissions were brief and seemed confused. The mechanical intelligence was trying to process behavior it had never encountered before. "They're analyzing us," she reported to the command center, "but their analysis keeps coming up with impossible results. They can't understand why we're not running." Amy looked at the tactical display showing human ships moving into attack formation. Fighter squadrons were launching from Earth and Mars. Defense platforms were powering up their weapons. For the first time in galactic history, the Void Swarm faced an enemy that was advancing toward it instead of fleeing. "Let them be confused," she said. "Confusion is the first step toward defeat." Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, staring at the blue marble that was Earth below him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the continents he had known all his life. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he barely noticed. The emergency transmission from Federation Command still echoed in his mind. The communication officer, Lieutenant Grace Miller, approached him with another message tablet. Her face was pale, and her hand shook slightly as she handed it over. Jake read the words that confirmed his worst fears. The Void Swarm was coming, and it was bigger than anyone had imagined. "Sir," Grace said quietly, "Admiral Hayes wants to see you in the war room immediately." Jake nodded and walked through the corridors of the defense station. Other officers moved past him with grim expressions. Everyone had heard the news by now. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever known was heading straight for the inner systems, and there was nowhere to run. Admiral Lisa Hayes was already waiting when Jake arrived. The war room was filled with holographic displays showing star charts and fleet positions. Representatives from a dozen different alien species flickered on communication screens around the room. Their faces showed the same expression Jake had seen countless times before when discussing the Void Swarm: absolute terror. "Captain Morrison," Admiral Hayes began, "I'm sure you've read the reports. The swarm has consumed 3 entire star systems in the Outer Rim. The Zephyrian colonies were the first to go. 30 billion souls gone in less than a week. The Zephyrian ambassador on one of the screens made a sound that might have been weeping. His tall, thin frame seemed to fold in on itself as he spoke. Our people remember the old stories. Our ancestors fled from this evil long ago. We thought it was gone forever." Another screen showed the crystalline form of a collective representative. Its faceted body pulsed with nervous energy as it communicated through light patterns. "The collective has already begun the scatter protocol. We are breaking our hive minds into fragments and sending them to the furthest reaches of space." Jake watched as each species representative reported the same thing. The mighty Drekmori warriors, known for conquering half the galaxy 1,000 years ago, were abandoning their homeworlds. The ancient ethereals, beings of pure energy who had existed since the dawn of time, were fleeing to parallel dimensions. Every single species that had encountered the Void Swarm had the same response: run as fast and as far as possible. Admiral Hayes activated the central display, showing the approaching swarm. It looked like a cancer spreading across the galaxy, consuming everything in its path and converting matter into more of itself. The scale was beyond comprehension. Thousands of mechanical ships, each the size of a moon, moved in perfect formation toward the inner systems. "The Federation Council has called for a vote," Admiral Hayes announced. "The Exodus Protocol will take every living being to the far edge of unexplored space. We'll abandon everything and hope the swarm doesn't follow." The alien representatives began discussing evacuation procedures. The Zephyrians would dismantle their floating cities and convert them into long-range ships. The crystalline collective would scatter their consciousness across 1,000,000 different vessels. Even the warlike Drakmori spoke of loading their breeding populations onto generation ships and fleeing beyond the galactic rim. Then Ambassador Kate Sullivan stood up. She was a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes, but her voice carried the weight of authority. "Earth abstains from the Exodus Protocol," she said calmly. The room fell silent. Every alien face on the communication screens turned toward her with expressions of shock and confusion. "I'm sorry," the Zephyrian ambassador said, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you say abstain? Surely you mean you need more time to prepare your evacuation?" Kate Sullivan shook her head. "No evacuation. We're staying to fight." The reaction was immediate and intense. Several alien representatives began talking at once, their voices rising in pitch and volume. The Drakmori war chief, a massive creature with 4 arms and skin like armor plating, leaned forward on his screen. "Human," he growled, "your species is young and foolish, but surely you are not insane. The void swarm cannot be fought. It can only be survived by fleeing. Every species that has encountered the swarm has the same genetic memory," added the ethereal representative, its voice echoing from multiple dimensions. "Run or die. There is no third option." But Kate Sullivan remained calm. "Perhaps there is. Perhaps running is exactly what it expects us to do." The alien representatives exchanged glances, and Jake could see they thought humanity had lost its collective mind. To them, staying to fight wasn't bravery. It was suicide. Over the next few hours, Jake watched as the greatest evacuation in galactic history began. Ships from hundreds of worlds started arriving at staging points, preparing to flee to the unknown regions beyond charted space. The Zephyrian floating cities broke apart like flowers, their pieces transforming into sleek evacuation vessels. The crystalline collectives, hive worlds, went dark as consciousness fragments, scattered in every direction. Commander Ryan Phillips was assigned to oversee the evacuation of non-human populations from the inner systems. He stood in the transport bay as the last Drakmori civilians boarded their ships. The children looked back at him with large, frightened eyes as if they couldn't understand why the humans weren't coming with them. "Why do your people choose death?" asked Elder Krex, one of the ethereal beings who had chosen to remain corporeal long enough to speak with him. Ryan thought about it for a moment. "Maybe we're not choosing death. Maybe we're choosing to live on our own terms." The Elder's energy form flickered with confusion before fading away completely. As the evacuation continued, Jake found himself back on the bridge looking down at Earth. The planet looked so peaceful from up here, but he knew that in 6 months the void swarm would arrive. Humanity would face the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, and they would face it alone. Grace Miller approached him again, this time with a smile on her face. "Sir, we just received confirmation. Every human colony, every ship, every military unit in space has voted the same way. We're staying." Jake nodded and took a sip of fresh coffee. Outside his window, the last alien evacuation ships disappeared into hyperspace, leaving humanity alone with their decision. He thought about his daughter back on Earth, his parents, his friends. They would all face the coming storm together. "Let's show them what humans are made of," he said quietly, and prepared for war.